You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have some major news in South Florida as it relates to Epstein. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, so a federal district court in the Southern District of Florida just sort of reversed course. Our viewers might remember that previously Pam Bondi had sort of made a big show about the fact that she was trying to get the grand jury transcripts unsealed so that the public could see them. Grand jury transcripts that were generated both in federal court up in New York and in federal court down in Florida, because Epstein over time was investigated in both of those federal jurisdictions. But the judges, I think, correctly ruled at the time that there was no lawful basis to unseal them. Specifically, there is a rule of grand jury secrecy, it's Rule 6E, that prohibits grand jury materials, including transcripts, from being publicly disclosed unless there is a certain exception that the judges concluded didn't apply. Well, what just changed? The Congress passed the Epstein Transparency Act, misnomer though that name may prove to be, and Donald Trump signed it into law. So basically, Pam Bondi's DOJ went back to the federal judge in Florida and said, well, guess what, Your Honor? Now there is an exception that takes the form of new legislation directing that these kind of materials must be disclosed publicly. And the judge, I think, appropriately ruled that that new law trumps or overrules the grand jury secrecy provisions found in Rule 6E, and the judge ordered the grand jury released. Now, that sounds dramatic. However, here's the rest of the story. We have already come to learn, Brian, that the stuff in those grand jury transcripts was already known publicly previously, and that goes for the transcripts in New York. It goes for the transcripts in Florida. But this is going to be a propaganda victory for Pam Bondi's DOJ. She'll beat her chest and say, you see, we're trying to be transparent, even though she knows full well that the public will learn exactly nothing new based on the release of these transcripts.
Right, but isn't that the thing at the end of the day, that if Pam Bondi applauds the release of grand jury transcripts, she already has those in her possession, along with countless tens or hundreds of thousands of other documents. And so isn't it just the peak of her being disingenuous, the fact that she is pretending that it's a win, that somebody else is releasing documents that she herself could release today if she wanted to?
Yeah, now technically she really did need the court's permission to release them. But let's face it, Donald Trump, Pam Bondi, Todd Blanche, and the rest of Trump's dirty DOJ leadership. I don't call the whole DOJ dirty because there are still more than 100,000 people who were there before Trump took power the second time, who are trying desperately to do the hard work of the American people rather than doing anything to please or not displease dear leader. And, those people are being fired, wrongfully terminated. Those people are opting out because they just can't bring themselves to work for this corrupt administration. But the dirty DOJ leadership has all but converted the Department of Justice into what I would call George Orwell's Ministry of Truth, which, as we know from the novel 1984, the Ministry of Truth was responsible for putting lies and propaganda into the public square to be consumed by the people. So all of this is a show. This is no different than when Donald Trump just wants investigations opened into people so he can run to his, social media platform and say, you see, these people are being investigated. This is just a variation on that theme.
I know that you said that she needs the court's approval to be able to do this, but what about the fact that Congress just voted and Trump just signed into law a new law mandating the release of all the Epstein files? Wouldn't the grand jury documents that Pam Bondi is going to pretend is some big win for transparency, if those are contained within the Epstein files, the law now is that all of that stuff has to be released. And so why are we even in a position where we're asking anybody else, any other institution, any other court, any other prosecutor, whatever it may be, to release anything else? The law is that Pam Bondi has to release everything, inclusive of what we're seeing at the court.
Yeah, Brian, so this is where the old career prosecutor in me kicks in. The status of this issue is that the last court order that was handed down by the federal judge in the Southern District of Florida was that the DOJ is prohibited from releasing this. Now, DOJ could have said, yeah, but you know what? There's a law that was passed in the interim, or since that ruling was handed down, that we think overrides the judge's ruling. Let me tell you, as a prosecutor, I wouldn't make that decision on my own. I would go back, I would tell the judge, listen, DOJ's position is that this rule now sort of supersedes, overrules Your Honor's prior order prohibiting us from releasing the grand jury transcripts. That's what I would have done. But to your point, Brian, the fact of the matter is the grand jury transcripts probably don't amount to 0.00001% of the Epstein files, and it happens to be that 0.0001% that we already know about because that information was released previously, which, yes, makes this whole thing nothing more than a game and, some PR nonsense that Pam Bondi is playing. But still, I don't fault the Department of Justice for getting the court's approval.
In the interim, is there anything that you presume Pam Bondi is going to do to prevent the release of these files? As far as we know, she's got about 2 weeks left with this mandatory 30-day period after this law was passed mandating the release of these files. And so is there any tricks that she could pull, any sleight of hand that she could engage in that would prevent the full release of this file, prevent full transparency from being had?
Oh, I would place my full $1 maximum bet on her pulling all kinds of nonsense tricks.
And by the way, when I say Pam Bondi, I say her as an appendage of Trump. She is not acting independently from Donald Trump, and so it's not her decision. Certainly not her decision going against Donald Trump in terms of suppressing any information that's involved in these files. All of this is being done on his behalf.
Exactly, but let's not give her a pass because, her sworn oath is to the Constitution and the people of the United States, not to Donald Trump. So I agree that Donald Trump is playing her like a little marionette and she's not willing to cut any of those strings. But this is also her misconduct, what she's doing, what Kash Patel is doing at the FBI, what Todd Blanche is doing as the Deputy Attorney General, the number 2 person at the Department of Justice. And so to answer your question, what do I think she'll do? She'll do, I think, one of 2 things. Remember, there were already 1,000 FBI agents who should have been out fighting crime, but instead they were directed to spend all of their efforts, their time, their energies pouring through the Epstein files to flag all of the references to Donald Trump that might make Dear Leader look bad. Brian, do we think now that, all of that work was undertaken, that Pam Bondi is going to fully disclose everything in there that makes Dear Leader look bad? Hell no. The only question in my mind is, does she selectively disclose certain batches of documents that don't contain damaging information, or does she perhaps comply with the law? That would be something novel for her, and disclose everything, but there's nothing but redactions when it comes particularly to anything that might make Dear Leader look bad or displease him if it were revealed publicly. I think those are the 2 most likely candidates. The one thing I'll put my full $1 max bet on is she's not going to disclose all of the unredacted Epstein files, as I think the law contemplates, the new law, with some exceptions. You don't want to, for example, re-victimize the victims. So I think there are some appropriate redactions to protect maybe victims' privacy. But beyond that, no, it should all be released. But I don't believe for a minute it will be.
What kind of recourse do we have if there are redactions that are not there to protect victims' privacy, but rather just to protect Donald Trump?
Here's the great recourse, and I think it's viable recourse. There will be suits brought in court, hopefully by people with standing. There will be people asserting their First Amendment freedom of the press, for example, and perhaps freedom of speech. There may be victims who bring suit. And what they will be able to do is they will be able to urge the court to give the court the entire unredacted Epstein files. Similar challenges were made to, for example, the Mueller report. When Bill Barr was playing games with the Mueller report, Judge Reggie Walton got his hands on, pursuant to an order he entered, the entire unredacted Mueller report. And then he famously issued an opinion saying that Bill Barr spun the Mueller report. Bill Barr's statements to the American people contradicted the Mueller report, et cetera, et cetera. Once a judge can get his or her hands on the full unredacted Epstein files, Brian, it's on. Because then the judge can make the determination, no. We will be protecting information about victims, but we will not be protecting Donald Trump. So I think that is probably in the near future. You're going to see that kind of litigation. And boy, I hope that a federal judge gets his or her hands on a full unredacted copy of the Epstein files.
And so would a judge be able to make the unilateral decision once they have their hands on the Epstein files to then release them if they find that, in fact, the information that's been redacted, isn't there to protect victims, but rather just to assuage the ego of Donald Trump?
The judge would not. Here's my take. Now, a lot of this is uncharted procedural waters. I don't think the judge would release them from chambers, for example. I think the judge would order the Department of Justice to release the following unredacted, entries or pages or, files in the Epstein case. And if the Department of Justice violated the court order, then I think the court might be within its right to go ahead and disclose them publicly itself. But all of this is the kind of dance that is not unusual for a court and the executive branch to go through. It's just that usually it's in very different circumstances, and it's not all about protecting the President of the United States.
Protecting the President of the United States who's implicated in a pedophile ring. That's the different part of all of this. Well, look, I think that we are very likely to see exactly that scenario play out. I think, obviously, whatever's in those files is bad enough that Trump has gone 11 months torching his own reputation to keep that stuff suppressed. He would rather the bad coverage on a daily basis, the drip, the associations with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, rather than just letting these files be released. So that says that something in there, in those files, is bad enough that he wants to suppress them. So even with this new law that he was forced to sign because the pressure was too heavy, I still presume that he's not going to give this thing out without a fight. I think you're exactly right in the sense that the DOJ is going to not only use but abuse their ability to redact any information in these files that reflects poorly on Donald Trump. But I think that if we get to a scenario where a judge either orders the DOJ or the judge themselves allows the court to release these files, that it'll be yet another unforced error at the hands of this administration, because it will show that not only is Trump implicated in the whole Jeffrey Epstein world, but he's also involved in this cover-up to prevent any of this stuff from coming out. And every single day he spends trying to suppress these files is even worse news coverage for him, and cements in everybody's minds the fact that he has some nefarious dealings with the most notorious pedophile in the history of this country. So obviously a lot more to come on this issue. For those who are watching, if you'd like to follow along with this and all other legal news, please make sure to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on this screen. So if you're not yet subscribed and you want to support our work, support independent media, the best way to do that is to subscribe. It is and always will be 100% free, and we'd really appreciate it. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.